The Embroidered Sunset by Joan Aiken, Chapter 9. "You are slurring that phrase," Benedict said. "Take it once more, from the top F." Lucy hit the top F, hit it again, and yet again it continued shrilling in her ear. "Foot off pedal," she thought. "We're coming to a bend. Better change down." The shrill note persisted, and, surfacing reluctantly from her dream, she reached out an arm for the telephone which stood by her bed. "Taking her time about answering," said Mrs. Marsham's voice. "As you're going that way, Harold, carry the thermometers round to the patients in those 2 rooms, would you? I'll be along directly. Tell them." "Hello?" said Lucy out of her fog. "Oh, there you are, Miss Culpepper. Are you awake? Would you come over to the house? Could you bring a roll of rubber sheeting that you'll find in the dairy next to the gardener's cottage? It's on a shelf wrapped in brown paper next to the—" Mrs. Marsham's words were interrupted by a man's voice calling from farther off. "Mother, better come in here." "What's the matter?" The matron evidently had her back turned from the receiver, but still held it. Lucy could hear the tick of a clock, and somewhere nearby a cat mewing. "She's gone." "Who?" "The old one." "Oh, excuse me, Miss Culpepper," Miss Marsham said hurriedly into the receiver. "Come over as quickly as possible, will you, with the sheeting? There's a great deal to do." "Okay." Lucy rolled out of bed and put on her robe and slippers. Did gone mean dead or run off? And who was the old one? She dressed at speed, tugged a hasty comb through her hair, washed in the tiny bathroom, ran downstairs and let herself out into the stable yard. The moorland air smelt cool with a tang from the large trees, pines and monkey puzzles that separated the stable quarters from the main house. Which was the dairy? There were several doors. One led to a shed full of plant pots and garden tools, another to a garage containing a white Rover, very mud-splashed. A third outhouse had a wide slate roof round 3 walls. This must be the dairy. Here Lucy found and identified the rubber sheeting. Odd, she thought, stowing the roll, which was too heavy to be carried far into her own car, and starting off. Odd there was such a lot of mud on that Rover. We haven't had any rain for over a week. Perhaps it was driven from some other part of the country, or hasn't been used since the last bit of bad weather. When was that? Thinking back, she recalled the thunderstorm of the day she had first come to Appleby. For a little while, the rain had been so heavy, she had been obliged to park. But since then, it had been dry, unusually dry, the locals said, for the time of year. Today, however, the sky was overcast and threatening. Good thing I got Aunt Fennel moved yesterday, Lucy thought. Even she doesn't want to go out. At least here, when it's wet, there will be room to stroll around indoors. Lucy had imagined that, once installed just outside Appleby, the old lady would wish to go on walks, to revisit old scenes, or call on old neighbors. But Aunt Fennel had calmly refuted any such notion. "I'll stay indoors at present, thank you, dearie. It's a lovely big house. I'll be able to get plenty of exercise walking about the hallways and passages, and I'll have the good air and be able to see the moors through the windows. And that other one would never dare try to get into a big place like Wildfell Hall with so many people about. It's quite safe so long as I stay inside." Well, it was to be hoped that Mrs. Marsham didn't have any inflexible rules about outside exercise every day for the inmates, or there would be trouble, Lucy thought, parking by the back door and going in through the kitchen. In a contest of wills, she had a notion that Mrs. Marsham and Aunt Fennel would be about equally matched. In the kitchen, she found Emma Chittick, who boarded at reduced rates in return for some housework, briskly fumbling about, putting knives and spoons and napkins on a trolley. "That you, Miss Culpepper?" she said, peering in Lucy's direction. "Matron said to go upstairs as soon as you get here and take the rubber sheets with you." She came closer to Lucy and hissed in a meaningful undertone. "What did I tell you? Old Alice Crabtree passed away in the night. Didn't I say she would? Poor soul, it's a wicked shame if you ask me. I reckon she would have lasted for a good while yet." Lucy was surprised and rather remorseful to see tears on Mrs. Chittick's wrinkled cheeks. "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you were so fond of her," she said diffidently. "Alice Crabtree and me have been friends since we was at school. Oh, we used to have our little difficulties, but that didn't mean I thought she ought to be put away. Is that you, Mrs. Culpepper? The matron called down the stairs. Bring a big kettle of hot water up, will you, and put on another. Emma, can you get on with making the toasts for the breakfasts? A window halfway up the stairs looked out over the front portico. As Lucy passed, she saw a man walk round from the side of the house, raise the bonnet of an estate van that stood there, and peer inside. It was the same man she had seen last night, but in daylight his resemblance to Russ was less marked. He was taller, fairer, with features less fleshy. His hair rose in a quiff. He looked like some kind of bird, maybe a snipe. Even so, the likeness was considerable, an odd coincidence. Dear Max, you would enjoy Wildfell Hall. Somewhere, quite soon, in a room containing a few instruments of torture, I am sure to find an old-fashioned cabinet of ebony and gold, which being only secured by massy bars and a padlock, I shall, after a few efforts, succeed in opening, and discover a photograph of myself as a child, a whole pile of mysterious laundry lists, 3 executioner's aprons, 2 winding sheets, and a shroud. The shroud brought Lucy back sharply to the thought of Mrs. Crabtree's death, as she went upstairs in a more sober frame of mind. As she crossed the landing, she heard the bonnet slam and the van start up and drive away. Was that my son leaving? Asked Mrs. Marsham, appearing and receiving the kettle. What nuisance! I was going to ask him to do a couple of errands in the village for me before he went. Oh, well, perhaps he could later on. Or well, perhaps you could later on, Miss Culpepper. It's useful that you have a car. When will your son be back? Lucy inquired as they made beds. She was still curious to get a closer glimpse at him. Oh, he doesn't live here. He just came over for a few days to give me a hand. He's an osteopath, has a practice in Birmingham, so he can't stay very long. It was handy having him here last night, though. Several of the measles patients were quite restless, and we had one old lady pass away. Dr. Agnon thought she might. That's too bad. Oh, you get accustomed to deaths in an old people's home, Mrs. Marsham said indifferently, whipping a mitered corner of sheet into place with professional skill. After all, it's what they come for, isn't it? Run down now and fetch the other kettle, would you, Miss Culpepper? Oh, and could you put these specimens on the desk in my office as you pass? And then see to the breakfasts. Feeling slightly blank, Lucy took bottles and kettle. Mrs. Marsham's outlook and her own appeared to be so dissimilar that there could be no contact. It was hardly worth making an effort to communicate. Anyway, she evidently doesn't want me communicating with her, Lucy thought. Depositing the bottles on the office desk, she noticed a framed newspaper clipping. It was from the Kirby Advertiser, and showed an uncompromising picture of Wildfell Hall, arches, pillars, stone balls, portico, and all, inset in the column of print underneath was a photograph of Mrs. Marsham, and the piece was headed Ex-Air Hostess SRN to run new old folks home at Appleby. A memory clicked into place for Lucy. And Lucy realized why Mrs. Marsham's features had seemed faintly familiar at their first encounter. Of course, she must have seen this article, without taking special note of it, while stacking piles of old newspapers in Uncle Wilby's attic. Perhaps there had also been a picture of Mrs. Marsham's son. Perhaps this had made Lucy imagine the resemblance to Russ. But no, the more she thought about it, the more she felt that the resemblance was real, just one of those inexplicable similarities. By now, the elderly inmates, such of them as could manage it, were up and hobbling downstairs in hopes of breakfast. Querulous Emma Chittick seemed to have set the tables and made toast fairly capably, despite her poor vision. Lucy hastily brewed up a cauldron of instant porridge. Eggs, too, we always have eggs, Emma said fussily. Always an egg for breakfast here. She's a hard woman, that Mrs. Marsham, but she do see we have a good breakfast, that I will say. Not but what I'd fancy a bit of bacon for a change instead of everlasting eggs. Boiled or scrambled? Scrambled, lots of 'em with bad eyesight can't manage a boiled egg. You serve the scrambled in those plastic bowls, and they eat it with a spoon, and you beat up the scrambled eggs with this. She reached up myopically and located the electric beater hanging on its hook. With the sureness of habit, she plugged it in, broke eggs into a bowl, and began rapidly beating them, while Lucy found an enormous skillet and set it on the aga. Set it on the aga. Wonderful gadgets they have now, said Emma, passing the bowl of yellow froth to Lucy and pressing the release knob of the beater. The corkscrew attachment shot out like a javelin and buried itself up to the hilt in a loaf of bread. Hey, you want to watch it with that thing? Lucy exclaimed, somewhat startled. You only just missed me. Hold it pointing down over the sink another time, or you're likely to stick somebody in the gizzard. Wonderful gadgets, droned Emma, paying no heed to Lucy, lovingly washing and drying the beater attachment. She replaced it in the head section and hung it up on its hook again. Is the egg ready then? That's good. I'll go and ring the breakfast bell. She hobbled off. It was plain, however, that she had, after all, taken notice of Lucy's words, and as she went about, she muttered, Yes, and there's some folks as would be all the better for sticking in the gizzard, if you ask me. Next minute, a brazen clangor worthy of the abbot of Aberthof broke out in the hall. Emma was plainly putting all her vindictive feelings into the breakfast summons. During the bed-making period, Lucy had found time to slip into Aunt Fennel's room and make sure the old lady was all right. Peacefully propped on pillows, gazing out at the grey-purple stretch of moorland visible beyond the grounds. Yes, thank you, dearie. I slept beautifully. The air here certainly suits me much better than all that smoke and fog down in Kirby. Disturbances? No, I never heard any. But then I had my hearing aid out, of course. I'm feeling quite rested, so I'll get myself up by and by after breakfast. Just you bring me a bowl of porridge and a cup of hot water. I'll put some of my own chamomile in. This Lucy did, when taking breakfasts to such of the bed patients as were capable of eating. Delicious, sighed Aunt Fennel, dropping a handful of yellow dust into the water, from which a bitter reek instantly arose. It's months since I was able to enjoy a real cup of chamomile. Darting away to her other duties, Lucy hoped that Mrs. Marsham would prove accommodating about Aunt Fennel's fondness for herbal concoctions. Dear Max, it's no use. I'm not certain in my mind about Mrs. Marsham. Efficient, she undoubtedly is. Eggs for breakfast, warm bedclothes, all very good, but kind? Old Emma's muttering about her love-hate mate, so we can discount, or can we? Measles plus pneumonia would be quite enough to finish off most old ladies. But on the other hand, it would be extremely simple to hasten somebody's end in such circumstances. Adnon did say Mrs. Crabtree was tough, though. Well, Adnon will have to come and sign the death certificate, won't he? He'd speak up soon enough if there was anything phony, or would he? She ran downstairs to cast an eye over the scrambled egg eaters, who were chomping away contentedly enough, seated at their red-topped tables, napkins tucked under chins, eyes fixed on vacancy, as they applied themselves seriously to what was one of the most interesting activities of their day. Outside the large windows, a steady rain streamed down from the slate-colored sky, and the mixed conifers heaved and thrashed raggedly. Inside, Wildfell Hall seemed peaceful and cozy, but with a threatening whiff of insecurity about it, like the hopeful warmth of the sun about to be engulfed by a thundercloud. Having dealt out second cups of tea and dollops of marmalade, Lucy bolted down a saucerful of scrambled egg herself, and then went up to ask what she should do next. Help me with the bed, boss. Mrs. Thwaites Anne said she'd come in at 10 and wash dishes. Mrs. Marsham yawned. For the first time in Lucy's short acquaintance with her, she looked tired. Her face was grayish pale, her eyes red-rimmed. And we will pause there.